Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm doing week 31 of my 2020 reads. This week was actually WorldCon, so I didn't read all that much, although I did finish one thing, I DNF'd a few others, and then I also want to tell you some of the highlights of WorldCon. So the book that I finished this week was Glasstown by Isabel Greenberg. This is a graphic work that I heard about from Laura at BookBubbler, who I will link below. And if you're not familiar with Laura's channel, I get a ton of really great recommendations from her for graphic works that I don't necessarily hear very many people talking about. So I really recommend her channel if you like graphic works. So Glasstown is very interesting. It is the story of the Bronte siblings and their imaginary town that they created called Glasstown. Now this is all based in fact, although the story itself is, fictionalized. And what's really interesting about this and what I didn't expect was just the dynamics between the siblings and also the issues that they had with sort of the world around them and the importance that Glasstown played in their sort of internal landscape. This book was really beautiful. The art style is a little unique, but it really worked for me. And it was very moving for me, actually, just seeing the conflicts between the siblings and also seeing all of the grief and loss that they had gone through. They had lost their older two siblings, which kind of prompted them to be pulled back home and sort of homeschooled for a while, where they invented Glasstown, this imaginary world for them to escape into. And it lasted through adulthood in such a way that it was really a coping mechanism in a lot of ways for them. And it was just so interesting to read about the ways that they handled grief and the ways that sometimes this imaginary place became a bit of a crutch and a bit of an all-consuming coping mechanism, sort of in the way that I think for a lot of people in the 2000s World of Warcraft became, where the real world seemed less real to them than this imaginary world. So I actually really enjoyed this, and I just had such a great time reading it, even though I really don't care very much about the work of the Brontes. It's not my style. I don't like the kind of melodrama that's involved in that. But I really enjoyed this book, so I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Now moving on to the books that I DNF'd this week, which were 2. The first was Ranma 1/2, Volume 6 by Takahashi Rumiko. So Ranma, if you're not familiar with it, is a series from the 1980s that was really, really popular about a boy, Ranma, who is a martial artist and went to China with his dad to study martial arts, but fell into some cursed pools of water, such that now whenever cold water is splashed on him, he turns into a girl. Hot water and he turns back into a boy. So this is a comedy series. It's got a lot of sports and fighting, and it's outrageous, really hilarious. And I'd read the first 5 volumes in this a couple of years ago. I've actually owned the entire series for like over a decade, and I've been meaning to read it. I finally picked up the 6th volume back in February or March, started it, read the first chapter, so 12%, and then I just have not picked it up since. And I realized that I'm probably not going to, so I decided to just DNF it at that point, which is 12% of this volume, because I found myself having some issues with it, and issues that I think if I had read it when I first bought it a decade ago, I wouldn't have had, but now I can't really look past. There's just such a difference in the way that gender is represented. Some of the jokes are very much related to gender stereotypes, and I'm finding that doesn't work so much for me. And there's also sort of a fetishization of Chinese culture in this, which I feel rather uncomfortable with. And I'm just realizing that this is not the series for me at this point in my life. It might have been then when I bought it, but now it's not. So I'm DNFing this book, and then I think I'm just going to unhaul the whole series. The other book that I ended up DNFing this week was 40 Love by Olivia Dade. And this is a book that I'd heard about from Kazen at Always Doing, who I will link below. She has really great romance recommendations. And she had recommended this book specifically to me because it has really good on-page consent. And that is the thing that I value very much. So I very much liked that part of it. It is also sort of a lighthearted book in a lot of ways. It's got humor and cuteness and these sorts of things, so that was really good. But I ended ended up DNFing it at 57% because I got a little frustrated with the dynamic between the heroine and the hero. So the story of this is basically there's a 40-year-old woman who goes on vacation with her friend to celebrate her 40th birthday. They go to a private island resort and she meets the younger 26-year-old tennis instructor there, and they kind of hit it off. So all of these things definitely I like. I like the middle-aged woman. She's also, you know, a bit curvy, these sorts of things. I like all of that representation, but there was some issues that I had with the way that the heroine had some insecurities and the way that they came out and often were sort of transferred to the love interest in kind of a negative way. So in the beginning, there's a lot of disparagement of the tennis instructor because he's younger. So saying things like, oh, you couldn't possibly understand, or things like, you know, you're such an unformed human being, you don't even know your opinions or yourself, and these sorts of things. And it was just really dismissive in a way that I didn't like. And she does get called out on that. But even when she's called out on that later on in the book, there's still a lot of insecurities that she has that leads to her pushing him away constantly, which puts him in the position of always having to reassure her. And that kind of dynamic wasn't something that I found really romantic. So I just wasn't really into it. It wasn't a bad book, but that dynamic just didn't work for me, so I ended up DNFing it. So those are all of the books that I read and DNF'd this week. If you have read any of these or you have any thoughts or comments, go ahead and leave those down below. I didn't read that much this week, mainly because I was really busy with WorldCon. So I want to tell you a little bit of a wrap up of how WorldCon went, how the Hugo Awards went, and just some other things that were really highlights for me this week. So if you're not familiar, WorldCon is the World Science Fiction and Fantasy Convention that gives out the Hugo Awards, which Sush and I have been reading for the past couple of months. We have a bunch of videos talking about our rankings for all of the different categories that we voted in, so I will link that playlist below. And they have a convention, a week-long convention every year in a different location. This year it was held in New Zealand, so it's called ConZealand, although because of COVID, they weren't able to hold it in person, and instead it was done virtually, so this is a first. And we and a bunch of other booktuber friends attended it virtually. We had planned to all go in person, but we still got to do video conferencing and chatting with each other, and we got to attend a lot of different panels. And there were quite a few panels that were really excellent, so I wanted to highlight a few. The first panel that I thought was a really good discussion was one on climate change, adaptation, and resilience. And this panel included a couple different people, including Arkady, Martine, and Darcie Little Badger. These were such great panelists. They really discussed the ways that nature adapts and is resilient, and just so many interesting things. I especially liked hearing what Darcie Little Badger had to say because she's an oceanographer, and she talked about things like how coral reefs adapt, and even with coral bleaching, they're still alive and they're still doing things. And it was a fascinating discussion. And I think that climate change is one of those topics that has been popping up in a lot of SFF in recent years. So that was a really cool one. Another really great panel was about history and science fiction. So the ways that history, real history, is incorporated into the science fiction that authors write. This also had Arkady Martine, because she actually is a historian of Byzantine Empire. And another good panelist on that was Ada Palmer, who studies, I believe, kind of censorship and information in Renaissance Italy. There were other panelists as well with different specialties, and just hearing them talk about the way that you can write to talk about history, to talk about the ways that events unfold, and also how random some of it is. It was a very fascinating talk, and I really enjoyed that one. And the last panel that I really wanted to highlight was one by Ada Palmer and Cory Doctorow talking about censorship and talking about the parallels between older forms of censorship, such as during the Renaissance, and modern forms of censorship through the internet and things like that. And just the way that they drew all of these connections and talked about censorship as something that isn't always done as a form of exerting power, but sometimes is done as a way of protecting people, or as kind of a form of love. So maybe if there was an author who had very incriminating things in their letters and somebody in their family was in charge of their estate, they might they might kind of censor some of that information to protect the kind of reputation of their loved one. These sorts of things. It was just such a great discussion. I really, really loved that. And they mentioned that there's actually an entire series of lectures that they did together along with some other guest speakers at the University of Chicago that is up on YouTube. So I totally want to watch that, and I will have a link to that below because it was really, really cool hearing them talk. Another highlight of the convention for us was going to readings. It's so great to hear authors you love read from their works. A couple of the ones that stand out to me are Arkady Martine. She did a reading from a Desolation called Peace, which is the sequel to A Memory Called Empire, which actually won the Hugo for Best Novel. And I cannot wait to read the sequel. It sounds so, so good. Another reading that we went to that I really loved was by Darcie Little Badger. She read a short story of hers that was so gripping. I absolutely loved it. So much so that I actually pre-ordered a physical copy of her upcoming debut novel, Elatsoe. I was so in love with what she read, and I really want to support her, especially because I want to read more Indigenous authors in general, but also just because I loved everything that she had to say in all the panels that I saw her in. So if you haven't looked into it, Elatsoe sounds really good, so hopefully I'll read that in a little while once it comes out. And the other reading that we went to that I really liked was by Sarah Pinsker. She read a short story as well, but I love her writing. She writes these kind of mysteries that are science fiction, and I just can't get enough of her writing. I really want to read her debut novel, which came out this past year, called A Song for a New Day, which I've also heard a lot of people saying is really timely because it's kind of this dystopian where people can't go outside. So I'm really interested in that one as well. Then the last thing that should have been sort of a highlight but ended up being a bit of a disappointment was the Hugo Awards ceremony itself. If you're not familiar with kind of what happened, I will link an article below that talks about it, but basically George R. R. Martin was the Toastmaster, and he spent hours during the ceremony sort of glorifying the history of SFF, especially a bunch of white male racist misogynist authors, and that was really problematic in a lot of ways. Although the winners of the awards were awesome and a bunch of them gave very excellent speeches. So if you're interested in seeing those, the Reading Outlaw actually did a condensed version of the Hugo Awards, cutting out kind of the George R. R. Martin bits and just focusing on the winners. So I will link that down below if you want to check it out. Also, another thing that happened that was really cool was that on the side of ConZealand itself was the ConZealand Fringe. So because there were some issues with inclusivity in the panels that ConZealand itself had put together, a bunch of different people, finalists and authors and people in the community, decided to put on their own additional panels. And so Claire Rousseau, who is a booktuber, I will link her below, was one of the people organizing this. They put together a bunch of different panels for this. I'll link that below, the playlist, as well as the website that kind of tells you about them. And that was really, really cool. So we watched a bunch of those as well, and they are free to watch on YouTube. So even if you had nothing to do with WorldCon itself, you can watch all of those for free. And there were some really great panel discussions. I actually even hosted one on my channel and just kind of moderated the chat. So there were a ton of great discussions. Oh, and one other thing that I wanted to mention as a resource was that one of the New Zealand authors, who is Maori, came up with a Twitter thread where she recommended a ton of different Maori books in case you're interested in reading more Indigenous New Zealand works. Whiti Hereaka. So I will link that Twitter thread below just in case you're interested in more New Zealand Maori works. Okay, so that wraps up my week, what I read, as well as kind of the highlights of WorldCon for us. I hope that you guys had a great week, and I am very much hoping that I'll get in a little bit more reading this coming one.